You're listening to the Producer Podcast. I'm your host, Micah Versman. Joining me today is Sarah Burnett. Sarah works as the producer for Reelcast Productions, as well as being involved with the Motion University program. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thanks, Micah. I'm glad to be here.
So this first question, a lot of people don't really like having to answer it again, but maybe briefly talk a little bit about how you got started with filmmaking.
Sure. I wanted to be a filmmaker, I think right when the San Antonio Independent Christian Film Festival started, and I realized that people could make films because I'd been doing skits and writing scripts and different programs from when I was young. So I was probably 12 or 14, and we made actually a 45-minute film in Ireland, and I directed and produced that, and my sister and I co-wrote that script. So we made it with my cousins. They were living over there at the time, and so that was kind of my introduction. And then I kind of took a break and finished high school, went into college, and I knew I liked film, but I ended up getting a degree in communications because it seemed more usable and a little broader, which I really ended up loving that degree with the emphasis in journalism, especially. So I kind of have a love for not just film, but true stories and what you can do in documentary or promotional work where you can really get to the heart of real people instead of just coming up with fictional characters. So I did that in college and then started working with a missions organization and became their communications director. And so through that, I started making films with them, and I was directing / producing on a lot of that stuff.
Cool. You definitely had a very unique filming location for your first film, as opposed to backyards like most people start with.
It was pretty epic. Just the house my cousins lived in had a lot of character that felt a little more film locationist than most houses here, and so that added a really cool dynamic. And you should have seen, like, my dear parents. I was 15, my sister was 13, I think, when we were making this project, and we somehow convinced them that one of our pieces of luggage for this international trip with 8 kids was to bring along this huge duffel bag of costumes. And then I used my uncle's computer to edit it because my computer back in the States wasn't capable, and I believe I ruined his computer for the amount of processing power that it had to do. So I had many very nice and kind family members who contributed.
Sounds like it. So getting started, was the producer position always where you gravitated towards? Because usually people think they want to run the camera or be the director and all that when they're first getting started.
So, yeah, originally, I think my passion was mostly just to tell stories and tell true stories. And so originally I did some script writing. It was fun. Honestly, my sister is more creative than I am, and so she ended up writing most of the script, and I sat there and did the planning and locations. And then, of course, I ran the camera because I was the only person who knew how to do that. But as I look back, I see a lot of producing through it all. And in college, I did a capstone project on how to run a volunteer program for nonprofits, and I realized that I had been organizing people since I was 5 years old. So I grew up with my cousins, right? And so there are 15 kids, and I was always the, hey, let's make a movie. Hey, let's do a skit. Hey, let's go do some ministry opportunity. I was always organizing to the point that I remember I was doing a little photo shoot. We were at a friend's farm with my sisters, and I was like, hey, you guys need to line up like this. It'll look a lot better. And people were like, you are so bossy. And I always felt a little self-conscious about that until I realized there were actual titles for some of this stuff. So as I look back, though, I think I started as a director type person because there was no one else to wear that hat. Mm-hmm. But I definitely always leaned into logistics and making it work for the people. And I was always taking people and putting them in a team that worked best for them. So I think I was a born producer. I probably didn't really accept that until 3 years ago.
Okay.
So, and the other, I guess I'll throw this in here. So last year, when we produced the Ellerslie project, I was actually pretty intimidated by that project because I had only technically produced films with Reelcast with crews of maybe 8 or less. And so here I had 25 people. There was a lot of travel involved with that. There was altitude, there was costumes, like there's just a lot of factors. So we get up in the mountains, and I'm like, I'm the newbie on this shoot, and here I am, and there'd been people who had done producing for Motion University before me, so I was like, there's people who know how to do this, like, how do I know? And I got up there, and I can't remember, I feel like it was like in the car, like as we're loading all the people, I realized that I had technically been a producer back when I did missions work in India. And so I think for me, the producer journey was like, I was always doing it, I just didn't have the title. And so I've actually really enjoyed in the last couple years just embracing that title. Like, this is what I do. I do numbers, I do schedules, I do hiring, I do project management, I do contracts. Like there's a title that covers all of this. But as far as getting started in it, it's kind of been something I've done for a long time.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's been interesting to hear everybody, how they ended up in the role of being a producer.
I'm sure.
I'm curious for you, because obviously producers kind of have a different creative mindset. What gets you as a producer excited about a project?
I'm a very results-driven person, and I come from a background in marketing. So if someone can prove to me that a project has an audience that needs or wants to see it and has a plan to get it out, like that's a fundamental thing for me. I love great stories, but I don't love working on projects that I don't think anyone will ever see. And so I've enjoyed this year. We've worked with some organizations who are really helping families and just listening to them like, oh, if we make this video, it will reach this audience, which will then affect this change legally, which will then give this freedom to a family. To be able to tangibly see that journey, I think is one of the most fulfilling. So yes, I mean, everyone loves a great creative story, but to me, I'm first and foremost motivated by if this is going to make an impact.
Neat. So when you first get a new project coming in, what's your process for kind of breaking it down to figure out what the budget's going to need to be, what all needs to be included?
So I'll just kind of explain our process. So normally what happens with us is we get a client who calls us and says they need a video. And our first questions for them are, how are you going to use it and who is going to watch it? And so we don't start any creative until we get to that, until we get those questions answered. We, as a production company, we have developed a pretty standard rate sheet or price sheet. And so I can give a live quote on the phone. And I would say I do about 30% of the initial calls. Like some of them come in because they know John Clay. And so if that's the case, we'll let him take the call. But he's in the editing room so much that it's often helpful if I can just give them a call. And we always ask, what's your deadline? What's your dollars? And then who are you trying to reach? What is your delivery? Where are you going to put this? So depending on the level of project, I'll give them a live quote on the phone. Most of the time we try to do a live quote. Otherwise, sometimes I'm just the secretary. And so to give our team a little bit of space, I'll say, hey, thanks so much for your call. You know, my director's in the editing room today. I just wanted to follow up and see what your project was. And a lot of times I get like a long backstory. We work with nonprofits. So I get a long backstory about how they're passionate about this or that. And I'll, thank them for that, listen to that. I try to just really listen to the client. And the other thing I really try to embrace in that first call is like, we love what you're doing. We want to be part of this. Sometimes if I don't know as much about them, I leave it a little more open-ended of like, we're going to have to talk about this with my team. I'll have to talk to my director and get back with you. So So that's kind of initial. And then from there, we have a pretty standard, like if we know how many days we're shooting, which we plan days based on how many interviews. We do a lot of interview based. And so John Clay just has a limit. He'll only do 2, maybe 3 interviews in one day because he likes to really fully emotionally engage. So once we figure out how many interviews, and then we figure out the level of B-roll. So some people, just want kind of live B-roll, like follow them around their office working with clients or whatever. Some people, we're going to do like a B-roll storyline. And so based off of that decision, we have a standard amount of shooting days that we will use. And so I'll just know, okay, this is kind of the shooting days, add in some travel, and I kind of know what we charge for that. And so that's the basis of our planning. I think one thing that makes Reelcast a little different, potentially, from other companies is that we start with the concrete details. So creative kind of follows actually figuring out who the audience is, where it will be delivered, and how much money they have. So we start with that, we get a signed contract, and then we go to creative. We pretty much have a policy as a company that we want people to come to us because they want to work with us. And that we will listen to them, we will work with them, we will make them what film is best for their organization. But that happens inside that contract phase, not outside. So we don't present completed concepts before they sign. Like we listen, we say, yes, we hear who your audience is, we know how to reach them. We would love to have more conversations with you. We have a process for that. If we can get a contract signed, we'll get this on our calendar and we'll get this started. So, and we pretty much put shooting dates in our contract even before we've really done creative. So we just we work a little bit more left brain in that way. I would say that it's helpful for the client because those are the questions they're asking first and foremost. 2, like, okay, I've got a vacation here, I've got a this there. And so instead of, giving them a grand vision and then not accomplishing it, we're starting with telling them what they're going to get, when they're going to get it by, generally. Getting a signature, getting our first payment, and then moving into creative.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's definitely a different way than a lot of companies do.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work to come up with great creative. And so we can serve them better if we do it inside rather than outside of a contract.
Mm-hmm. So what's then your pre-production process look like since, you're waiting to come up with that story concept till after the contract's signed?
So we get a signed contract. Usually then we have a meeting to really hear from them about who their audience is. And we start throwing out ideas like, okay, have you seen this product by your competitor here? We use, different videos from different people in the same space to say, hey, have you seen this one? So John Clay will go do some initial research and just pull up different ads, commercials, promos, whatever, and say, is this something you guys want? So we have kind of that initial meeting, and then John Clay manages the creative. And so some of it's pretty standard and I can manage. Like I know that we want, usually about 4 interviews and from a variety of clients. So older, younger, age, just all those different factors we want to include to show the breadth of who they reach. And so I can kind of get that started. I usually, though, first and foremost, we lock in shooting dates and we start working on basic location information. So like, are we filming the interviews at your office? Are we going to have to rent a location? Those types of things. And then I'm like at the same time booking lodging for the crew and booking any flights or rental cars. So I love to book those like 6 to 8 weeks out. It's just a lot more affordable. I look for free cancellation. I usually do Airbnbs for my crew. And the earlier I get those, the better. If I have free cancellation, if something changes, I can adjust. But we start with dollars and then we move to those dates and get some of those just firmed up. I guess I would say kind of simultaneously with that, John Clay's working on that creative.
Okay.
So in a standard promo situation, we're going to film the 4 interviews, and we're going to film B-roll. We've had the 3 most unique projects was the Alert project that we did, that we wanted stylized B-roll, and so we needed people in uniform, and we needed a lot of them. And so those types of creative decisions do affect the producing a lot more, because we need to make sure that many guys are on campus and are available. So that kind of affected that project. The other complex was we did a birth center, and they wanted real birth footage. But because they were at least 5 hours drive from our house, we couldn't just have John Clay up there for the amount of time he would have to be up there to kind of wait and see if there were any live births. Plus, live births can be complicated, and so we just decided to go ahead and fake that whole birth. But then on the producing side, we had to find an actress and her husband and her kids, and was she going to be pregnant, and how far along was she? Like, there was just a lot of complexity to that. And so that was complicated. And then Ellerslie, we can maybe talk about Ellerslie separately, but we just kind of picked, for Ellerslie, we picked dates, and we knew a general location. So we knew we wanted to be in Colorado. And as far as what location, I didn't have to have that locked in. I just needed those dates originally.
Okay. So with experience in both the promo and narrative filmmaking worlds, have you discovered there's benefits or challenges when it comes to the budget in either making promos or doing narratives?
I have worked almost exclusively on promo, and when I've worked on promo, we've done some like narrative B-roll, and then my more like free-flowing, not so client-based work was for the nonprofit I used to work for. And so on that one, there was a little bit more freedom in the budget, because it had to be made, and it had to be made the way they wanted it. And so it was kind of like, if we needed a little more budget, there was reason to put that in there. Like, obviously we were trying to stay low budget. So, and I was not like an executive producer on that. I was more of a line producer. And so I just have to go up if I needed more money, which that project's kind of morphed as it got made. So that one gave me more freedom. With the promotional work, I always a little bit dread if we're going the more narrative direction, because things always do creep up in the budget more than just if we're showing up at their location. Like, if we show up at your location and we film where we're, if we film on campus with what you have, and then we do B-roll of literally what you do every day, obviously there's not a ton of line items I have to manage for that. And so that's pretty standard then. I know my crew costs, I know my travel costs, I know my gear costs, and that's kind of all that goes into that. When we start to move into a narrative realm, the trick is telling a story at a level that it deserves to be told on a budget. And I found that to be quite challenging. And what I do in those situations is I really lean into my director. And thankfully, John Clay has a good understanding of what elements make a project great. And so for the Ellerslie project, for example, the location we didn't have to pay for. So that was a huge benefit, right? And in Colorado, there's a lot of natural beauty. And so that was that wasn't a line item, but it added production value. But where we did lean in to our budget was to get a really great costume, because John Clay wanted that to look really authentic and real. And so that, again, was one of those projects that it's challenging to plan. I had never purchased, it was a 14 to 17 piece medieval warrior costume. I had never purchased that in my life. I had no idea how much to budget. I could do the research for that ahead of time. What I ended up doing is leaning into my art director, and she really gave us multiple options and budget ranges. And so we ended up making the decision that was best for the project. And so those are some of the messy things I've run into with narrative that I don't normally run into with promo.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure.
And so on Ellerslie, like, what would have been really difficult is if I couldn't get a location. And I have paid the types of locations we were looking at. I've paid for those before on other projects, and they're not cheap. And so that is like a little bit of, you have to know your budget. You have to know how far you can push it, and just make those decisions and understand that no project can be 100% of your dream, like in every single little detail. You can't put everybody, I mean, you could potentially, but I think as a producer, it's wise to understand you can't put everyone in 5-star hotels, feed them steak every day, and rent Aries and Alexas, you know, get 17 professional crew members and film in the Bahamas, and like you have to pick. And so those choices happen. They happen whether you have $1 million or $5,000. And so being able to figure out what this project is kind of helps that process, which I think is why for us as a company, we start with your audience. Because if we kind of understand that, we also know, yes, we're going to do our absolute best work, but they may not need a, you know, Ferrari car commercial. They may literally need testimonials, and understanding that about the client helps you serve them and serve the budget, which also ultimately serves them, because they are the client, and I don't want to spend any more of their money than deserves to be spent to meet their needs. And so that's kind of how some of that works for us.
Okay, yeah, no, that's cool, because I've been thinking through that with a project right now. Like, this is what I want to do, but how do I make that work?
Yeah. One of our other kind of tricks that I love to use is looking at each project and deciding which crew members are absolutely essential for greatness. And so one thing that we've done is John Clay, you know, he has been a director of photography in the past. He doesn't do as much of that now, but really he is very happy and comfortable managing the camera and the look. What he loves is a great gaffer to really do a lighting that fits the story. And so we've started, instead of hiring an op, which was what we did when I started working with Reelcast, we've started hiring a gaffer. And it gives the director, it helps us shorten our timeline a little bit, because we don't need the director DP meetings and communications as much. But we still get that really cinematic look with our gaffer. And not every project we are starting to bring in sometimes a DP depending on the level, but just understanding, we've had a couple projects where a gaffer was more needed than a cinematographer or an art director, and knowing kind of what each project deserves really can help your budget while still making great work.
All right, yeah, that's definitely a good thought. And it kind of ties in, the next question I was going to ask was, what's your process for determining what crew are needed for projects? I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to what you've already said.
So, when John Clay kind of finalizes his creative direction, we usually send a mood board and also just some paragraphs about how we want the audience to feel and what we want them to do at the end to the client. And then we send it to them right before a meeting, like 2 minutes before a meeting, so that we can personally represent it and explain what we are trying to do. And so that's really important for us to get that sign off at each stage. And then once they approve it, that's when we kind of move into finalizing our interviewee list and finalizing our crew. And so we actually hire a crew kind of late in our process, because we want to make sure the client is on board with it, because crew is usually a large portion of your budget. Mm-hmm. And so we want to be respectful to our crew members. And so we don't want to call them in a dream world and be like, hey, potential project, we try to kind of have it nailed down, have a number in mind of what we can afford, or at least be able within a couple days of that phone call to get back with them and say, okay, we took your day rate, we plugged it in, here's where things are at, here's how this is going to work for you. And something else we try to do with crew is give them a chance. If we don't have their asking rate, at least give them a call back and say, hey, we really appreciate that you guys talk to us. We really want to work with you. Here's kind of where we're at on this project, and we're not offended if you decide that that's not going to work for you, but we don't want you to ever feel like we assumed that we didn't have what you wanted and we just walked away. And so we've done that on a couple projects. One time, there was a director of photography that John Clay really had been hoping to work with on something, and we just weren't able to make it work, but we still gave him the call back and we're like, hey, we just, this is where we're at. He was like, yeah, that's not going to work. And so we moved on. We were able to find another guy. But just, we want to treat our crew well, especially in compensation in any way that we can.
That's a good way of approaching it, for sure, and keeping people in the forefront of your mind instead of just the project.
Absolutely.
How do you handle producing projects while at the same time raising a family?
So actually, I've found producing to be one of the best fits for me at this stage. Just on a real practical level, I do kind of protect my afternoons for work. So I am a stay-at-home mom, and that's kind of my emphasis. But I do protect for myself a couple hours in the afternoon to work on projects. And then I fit in other things as needed. Usually I can take a short phone call with the kids, kind of occupied doing something. And so that works pretty well. And so I use nap times, and then on projects, I usually try to bring someone who can be totally dedicated to the kids so that I can take some time. And one thing is, I've set up kind of strict limits on how much producing I'm doing right now. So I was actually invited to be on the producing team for a film, and it was going to be at least a 2-week shoot. And I am just not at a stage where I can take that, so I don't take those level of projects, but especially the promo work, I kind of know what our family can do and handle, and so a 4 to 5 day shoot is very doable for us, especially when I have childcare set up. And then as far as the actual producing work, a lot of it happens before the shoot. But it can happen on my iPhone is my favorite office tool. And I am on my phone quite a bit between texting, emailing, and project managing. And so that's something where I feel like I can be a responsive producer, but not have to be in my office away from my children. So that's a trick I've used. And then for me personally, I only at this point produce projects that are Reelcast Productions projects and where John Clay is the director. And that's kind of another big piece for me as a producer is I produce for a specific director because I understand him, and I also know the respect he has for production and for his producer and for the budget and timeline. And so John Clay is very easy to AD. He's very easy to produce with because he is left-brained enough that he respects those elements at least the same, if not a little bit more than the creative. Creative needs to serve the project. We're not here to just make cool stuff. And as fun as cool stuff is, and we have definitely pushed projects to that level, understanding when to make those creative choices, I end up not having to bear the burden of that because I work for him. So kind of in our company, I refer to him as director and executive producer. And I see myself a little bit more as a line producer. And so I'm not shouldering the budgeting, the hard decisions. If we have hard questions, they go to him. He's the CEO of our company. He is the one who will be directing this. And so that's kind of where I'm able to pass some of the responsibility off, because honestly, I love office work. I have loved office work for like at least 10 years. Like you'll just always find me gravitating towards a computer to write, to edit, to make budgets, like just anything. Just give me a spreadsheet. I'll fill in a spreadsheet. If I need to clean the house, I use a spreadsheet. If I need to cook, I use a spreadsheet. Like I just use spreadsheets. So that is not stressful for me to do. And so that's something I can easily take on. I can make it fit into my day. And I can get production, since our production times are usually fairly short, covered, and leave some of that really decision-making level of producer work up to him. And that doesn't, like, I definitely have opinions about all of that, but I have chosen to, like, stay in my lane a little bit more, and so I will voice my opinion, but I'll let him make the call, and that also just really saves us on time. So I'm not fighting for the project to go my way, which rarely we disagree, but I am here to serve the company and the project and his vision, because he's the director and the executive producer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure.
And I guess I would follow up on that and just kind of say, even if some of your audience is doing this like as a one-person project, like they're a director, producer, EP, communicating with the client at all times, all of those things, I would recommend splitting those out a little bit for yourself, and just, work for yourself. When you're doing creative, do creative. Keep it separate as if you were just a director. Then come to yourself as a producer and have a meeting and see if that's viable. But some of that separation, I think, is helpful if you're doing the one-person projects, which I have definitely been the director and the producer and the UPM and the AD. Like, I've done those types of projects, and just being able to segment. Like, I'm a director right now, but then as soon as filming ends today, I'm a producer and I'm prepping for the next day. And just kind of being able to delineate, I think, helps. There's a reason film sets have all those roles, and it can be really helpful to break those up a little bit.
Do you have any tips or things you found that work really well communicating with the client about, especially the logistics of schedules, of when you need certain people or certain rooms and all that?
Right. Yes, I actually have a fairly simple but organized process for that. So usually what I do is kind of on the tail end of that creative meeting, they're like super excited. They've seen the visuals, they've seen the vision, they hear what we're trying to capture, this whole thing. And so John Clay's done a lot of that talking. I'll come on at the end and be like, hey, so we're going to need about 4 interviewees, and I'll explain to them the different types of interviewees we're looking for, who we usually look for, like explaining things like, we don't just need, the goal is not the best person you can put on camera. The goal is the people who are most passionate about your organization. So some of those things are really helpful to do in a phone call or a Zoom call. They come off a lot better because you can add emphasis, whereas email, as you know, is just so black and white. So I'll go over with them what we're kind of looking for, and I also usually go over, hey, what hours is your location normally open? What's kind of availability? We've worked with moms with little kids as interviewees. We've worked with students at programs, and so kind of hearing from them, like, how are we going to get these interviews? How's that going to work? So I kind of do most of that on the call, and then we pick a general location too on the call. So whether it's your office or, the church that you rent or whatever that kind of is, we do that right there on the call. And then I send them a follow-up email the next day usually, and it has pictures of what colors of shirts I would like them to wear. It has location pictures. Usually I've been to the location or I've gotten a hold of location pictures. And so I do those 2 things. And also included in that document is the time slots for interviewees. And and then I also put in there a brief paragraph about what we're looking for in the interview, and that we want it to be conversational. They don't have to have rehearsed lines. We want it to be laid back. We'll walk them through it. It will be edited. Like, it's just a little paragraph, because I know that these interviewees, I don't directly reach out to them. I feel like it's better for the client to say, hey, we know that you love our organization. Will you be willing to work on this video? Here's the time slots. And then I have them CC me on those emails. And I usually only get involved if I am like having to rearrange the schedule at the last minute. But the more the client can do, like, I want those interviewees to see the client and realize that they're working with them. And then when I come in, I try to represent the client as well as I can, to say, hey, we are on the same team as them. We're making a video for them. We're so glad you came to share your story. We love them too. Like, just trying to kind of simplify it for the interviewee. So they're not wondering, hey, who's this random, what's a producer and why are they reaching out to me? And is this a scam? Or, like, I just want to get rid of any of those questions and just have them feel all of those positive things that they felt about this organization through the whole process of working on an interview.
All right. Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm definitely gonna take some notes on that for myself.
Well, and as I'm sure you know, when people show up in an interview, like, one thing that we found is the whole shirt color thing. Is like, they show up in checks, they show up in logos, they show up in all this stuff. And I want it to be positive. I don't want them to feel bad right out of the get-go. And so that's one thing I've really loved. I normally put in a palette. It's not super picky. I get it off of, there's palette generators online. So I'll literally like take the wall color from the room, put that into a palette generator, and then it'll generate me like 3 or 4 other colors, and I'll just say, hey, wear something in this range. And we've had, literally, there have been projects where nobody showed up in any of the colors I said. But I feel like, they were in the vein of what we needed. And so I'm just trying to cast a little bit of vision. Like, this is the room, so I use a picture of the room. This is the room where we're filming, or this is the look of the campus, whatever. And then here's, like, some colors. That would be great. And bring, like, I always tell them to bring 2 or 3 options. So we've had a couple people change. Again, it's about making them comfortable, so they tell the most compelling version of their story on camera. So I remember we had an interview where the guy's shirt was wrinkled. Like, his collar was wrinkled. And of course I noticed it like 5 minutes in. And you just, like, you'll break it. There's emotion. My husband, John Clay, is really good at opening those interviews. Hey, and like building this just great feel for the room. And I'm like, I can't tell him to change it. And so I remember like sitting the whole interview like, oh, great. We have a wrinkled shirt. This is going to be horrible. Guess what? I literally have watched that video many times and I have never noticed the wrinkled shirt. And so that's too, like, I think if you can keep people and emotion and experience like forefront as a producer, it really helps. Because more than anything, we need their heart and passion. And so the main thing I don't want to do is do anything that would disrupt that.
Yeah, no, that's all really, really good. I still struggle. I tell them, I'll get even specific about like a shirt color or patterns, and nope.
Nope. Yeah, I know. That's where the options help some in that. And even then you're just like, okay. But part of it too is they're individuals and we're trying to show their individuality. And so I'm okay a little bit if it's not exact. Obviously there's things that do not work on camera and like certain patterns and stuff. But normally we make it work. And wrinkles, that is not the only interview I've had to deal with wrinkles. And wrinkles don't show up as much as you think they would. So things you learn.
Good to know. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. Join us next time on the season finale of the Producer Podcast as we continue our conversation with Sarah Burnett and dig into her post-production process as well as a recent promotional shoot she was a part of. Until then, make sure you subscribe to the Producer Podcast, and thanks for listening.